Our next topic is about education, and I'm going to go to Ian Faulkner, who was the principal of Wesley College for many years and principal of other schools before that. And Ian, this is clearly close to your professional heart. Is there any one party where education policy is shining out as a clear vote winner because it's a sound policy?
Short answer is no. I hear arguments that I can relate to being proposed by a number of parties. So, for example, I warm to the Labour policy of making tertiary education more accessible to all people. But I don't necessarily warm to what I hear is a scrapping of any form of national assessment or indication of where individual students are at a particular time. Now, the whole question of national standards is another matter. It's something to be unpacked in quite some detail, but I believe it is necessary for us to know where our young people are at a particular time, so that once knowing that, we can move them to the next stage in their development.
Did I hear that Labour had just announced that it was giving now 3 years free tertiary education, or did I mishear that?
That was in tonight's news.
Right. Good idea or not?
Well, I think Ian's leading to a really important point. It's not just about the free to the student part of education that's important. It's actually, are the government prepared, or any prospective government prepared, to fund the cost of education? And I would suggest that's across both tertiary, secondary and primary, so that you remove the need for parents to have to pay these voluntary contributions in order for their school to stay open. I would rather the promise were to providing a more total education package rather than just no fees. Okay, because if you remove the fees, how do universities suddenly cope with all these extra students that come on board when we know already that our university and the international scales are sliding downhill because they're underfunded? I would argue the same applies to our secondary schools, unless they want to make all our secondary schools into charter schools, which won't save any money anyway. But I certainly recall in my involvement at Wesley with Ian, the inability of governments to fund education properly is just legendary.
Yeah, can I add to the comments that have already been made? I'm deeply cynical of the idea that you give free education to university students so that they could freely do nothing for 3 years. My view is that I think universities should be a choice, and it should be elitist in the sense that you go there because you choose to go there, not because you have a package that allows you to sit there for 3 or 4 years and maybe get a degree or maybe not. I think the university has intentionally moved towards the high-end achievers, where the people who are supposed to be there are supposed to be the ones who do what they actually studied for. So I'm pretty much in the camp that university really shouldn't be encouraged with free money. It should be there because people choose to be there to do something that is actually useful for the country. And we get that, in my case, we're having to fund and support our own son, who is probably going to come out with a debt of something like $100,000 to $150,000. But that's intentional, and that's because he chooses to do something that he thinks will contribute to people and to the country and to himself. So I'm not sure whether this is just vote buying or good policy, but it seems to me that we have a number of university students who probably don't put the money that they have already borrowed into good use. I do like the idea around charter schools. I think the more options, as John had mentioned, the more options we have for different students and different people, the better, rather than a conveyor belt where we all go to university or we all go to Unitec or whatever.
I would want to check the definition of tertiary. So tertiary to me is what happens beyond a secondary school. And I know of many young folk who find any form of tertiary education simply beyond them because they cannot afford the course fees, they cannot afford the transport to get to the place where their course is taking place. They don't have the necessary equipment. So the idea that there can be wide access to all young people to further train, whether it be in a polytech, as an apprentice, or in a university, is something that I would want to celebrate.
John?
Yes, I would agree with Ian's comment, Ben Westerfield, that you need a wide palette of options. There's a cautionary note, though, isn't there, around the elitist Westerfield. I think you're using elitist in a particular way. But if elitist is, it's only available those who can really afford it, is a problem that I think it is Piketty in his book on capitalism highlights, that actually it's elitist in that it's only available to those who have access to the scholarships and grants that you can get, say, at Harvard University or somewhere like that. If it's elitist in terms of striving for outstanding achievement, fine. The dilemma I have with all of the processes we've got around education at the moment are I notice a large number of people I've had to work with who will have 2 or sometimes 3 jobs in order to support their children through secondary school and university. And in some cases, picking up Ian's point, I would argue to them, but why are you sending your child to university? Now, there might be a very good reason, but it's often just the idea that, well, if they get a degree, they'll get a job. One of the real difficulties I had in the mission was Samoan and Tongan young people turning up, with their deep commitment to the church and bringing with them their CV, which in some ways was sad, because in it they had a degree that wasn't worth very much, yet they had borrowed an enormous amount of money to get something that I'd want to say to them, this will not get you a job.
That touches on the... Oh, go for it, Wes.
Yeah, can I add to that, John? I think it's important that, this bunch of money that's sitting there because you want to go to university, it's actually going to provide, as John had alluded to, this great future, which in some cases doesn't actually exist, despite the money and the debt that some parents and some students have gotten into. So I think it's a very cynical vote-buying ploy. It will benefit some, but the majority will end up, particularly from the marginalised immigrant communities of Tongans and Samoan and other groups that have come in and have tried to make their way, most of them will struggle to get into some of those corporate places or jobs that are going to give them a reasonable living. It does depend on the school you go to in many cases, and it does depend too on the networks you have. And for me, watching some, as John had seen, some of these students who have put their life and savings into a law degree or whatever, are actually having to go back to do something in the public service like the Ministry of Social Development with the law degree. And yet it's cost them a packet. And this is where I think some of this stuff is actually quite cynical and misleading. Because you go to university does not necessarily give you the kind of economy that you are hoping for your family or for your future. Despite the idea, as you say, Ian, it should be available to everybody. The reality is that some people get in, if you happen to be from Auckland Grammar or King's College or Remuera, and most of those kids who are coming from South Auckland or West Auckland will probably end up in the very...
Well, those are really interesting and quite powerful sets of arguments against Jacinda's announcement of free tertiary education for 3 years. I thought she might be on more of a vote winner with the idea that you did it for 1 year and worked out whether this was the right thing. You know, this was a kind of a pathway that could open up. I'm not convinced by that policy. Pardon me, the two of you have both mentioned, and Ian certainly touched on it, economic disparity among these young people. Are the young people trying to get into tertiary education at any level, if they're coming from a very poor background, it's just not simply going to work for them. And I think that was your point, Ian, that they don't have the tools, they don't have the background, they don't have the resources to be able to cope with it. So how much of a problem for New Zealand society is this widening gap between the rich and the poor? Have we, in fact, through the last 9 years or possibly even beyond, have we legislated for an impossible disparity? Will it ever be bridged?
Well, if I can come to that question, David, from the point of view of an immigrant myself and from the more marginalised community within our New Zealand society, I think there is progress, and we have to acknowledge that there is progress because education has given some of these communities and families the opportunity. But it's not progress at the kind of pace that is needed. For every 10 Pacific students, for example, one might get into Russell McVeigh or to Theology or something like that. They are making progress, but it's not keeping pace with the kind of changes that we need to make in order to bridge some of these economic disparities that are obvious, not just within certain sectors or families of our New Zealand society, but in actual demographic segregation areas of Auckland, for example. There are huge gaps that I'm not sure whether these are multiple generational progress or really one generation. I don't know, but it doesn't seem to be keeping...
Philly, would you say that
required now.
Since you were a young lad growing up in West Auckland going to Kelston Boys, that you have noticed over your lifetime, now that you've got sons who are entering the workforce with student debt, have you noticed that this has become a bigger problem sort of year by year and irrespective of governments, that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer?
I think that's generally the issue, is that there doesn't seem to be the critical mass of these migrant communities keeping up with the changes and the growing gulf between those who have enough and those who are struggling. But the other change, of course, is in the population. You've got more Asian kids now who are coming into the country and overseas students who are coming in. The competition is much greater. And of course, you've got other opportunities in terms of sports. So you've got kids who are not only having to compete with a great amount of capable students, and some of them are brilliant students, but you've got other alternatives, which has all its risks of, it's like rugby. I mean, every kid wants to be an All Black, but not everybody's going to make it through an injury or that sort of thing. And so there are those risks. I'm not optimistic as I would want to be in terms of some of these marginalised communities being given enough
any
of a
comments?
break
It's your
to make a difference.
area too.
So my concern is for quite a number of young people that believe that they do not have any hope for the future, that they are stuck in the position where they're at, and they have no means of finding a way out of that. And it's that group which I see increasing, not decreasing. And it's unfortunate in my eyes that that group are from largely from particular ethnic groups, and once those young people become entrenched in that, they then move on to other paths, and we know that the prison population is, or a move towards ending up in prison is there. And I don't believe that is a good scene for New Zealand for the future.
Yeah, I've wrestled with this one because employed over 200 home care workers. And you might recall that this was the group that there was a significant employment court case over, who were simply the lowest of low paid because they were women. So the first disparity I think governments have to be prepared to simply name and deal with is the gender disparity. So that you have, if you're doing a job, it's the same whether the pay is the same whether you are male or female. The other one is the disparity between those who have that opportunity by the simple fact that they are Pākehā. And I find that deeply disturbing because at one level it shouldn't be there. And yet, statistically, it is. There is a disparity. So that you create this low-waged cohort simply by saying, well, we can afford to pay this type of job less per hour because it does less. In brackets, because predominantly done by Māori, Samoan or Tongan or Fijian. It will not be done by Pākehā. So there's that type of disparity. The ways of addressing that have been, for example, to talk about the living wage. I'm not a fan of the living wage because the problem with a living wage, it ends up by becoming the minimum wage. And the moment you talk about a minimum wage, you talk about pay bands and relativities, so that it's always at the bottom of the heap. So that you then also start talking about high income earners earning no more than 8 or 9 times more than the lowest band. I am sort of in favour of that. I think that's the one that within the Methodist Church missions we've tried to operate with. When I say try, it's exactly that. We've not been successful, but we have tried. We've talked about and we're hearing about the use of taxation. Now, I'm quite in favour of using taxation as a social tool for ensuring that there's a better distribution of wealth. It can be that. But we only deal with the disparity between people who are on a wage. The biggest disparity is actually between people who earn a wage and those who don't need to earn a wage. The wealthiest people on the planet do not earn any money. Their wealth is tied up in their assets and their businesses and their share portfolios and goodness knows what else, which they can live off, and yet they've got nothing. I recall the days when where there was means testing applied to a number of benefits. Most of the people who got the benefit were those who, for many of us in the community, simply saw as being very wealthy, but actually they were able to hide their income. So disparity is a very complex issue. And I think it's not just about saying we will impose this on people in order to introduce a better economic distribution or to address economic disparity. we all have to feel a social obligation and a social justice obligation to ensure that there's a better distribution of wealth across everyone's needs. And I think we should see it as a privilege to pay some form of tax, regardless, because we know it will benefit someone who actually needs it more than I do.
I think I'd like to bring this part of the discussion to a close with the observation that the American philosopher John Rawls wrote a very interesting book called The Original Position, or argued rather for what he called the original position. And he said, let's, as a society, we should make up the rules around taxation, wealth distribution, etc., and everyone should have an equal opportunity to participate in the making of it, but no one is able to say in advance what position they will occupy in the society when they're making the rules.